Leaders. I'm talking to all the leaders. If you are a leader, it doesn't matter, a leader of a company, leader of your household, a pastor, a coach, I don't care what type of leadership role you hold, I need you to hear me today. All the leaders, it's very easy, man, for us to lose sight, to misconstrue our true role in our leadership, in the grand narrative, right? In the grand narrative of your company, in the grand narrative of your family, right? In the grand narrative of your pastorhood, pastorship, pastorness, whatever role you play as a leader. Is very easy for us to misconstrue, to misunderstand, to lose sight on our true role in leadership. And that's what we're going to talk about today, man. Understanding your true role as a leader. Who are we, man, as leaders? Those of us who consider ourselves as leaders of other people. Who are we really? What is our true role as a leader? And it's very easy, man, for us to misconstrue that question, right? Yeah, it's you being interviewed on the internet and TV. Yes, it is your face on the magazine. Yes, it is your face on your book. Yes, when people think of your family, they think firstly the parents, you know. Yes, when people think of Apple and Twitter, they think of the CEO as the forefront of that venture, right? But are they? Are they truly the main character in the narrative? I don't think so. I don't think that we are the main character in what God has called us to do. God never calls us for and to us. God always calls us for and to something and someone else. It's never about you. And a prime example is found in 1 Chronicles. 1 Chronicles, the 21st chapter. Turn to that if you like. I'm not going to read the whole story. As I say every week, you can go and read it yourself. I'm just going to bring out verses that helps me explain and make the point that I'm trying to make. In this story, David had the bright idea to go and count the Israelites, right? And it turned out to be not the brightest thing to do. Now, I've heard many an explanation as to why David did that and what is the true story, the meaning of this story. And the one that touches me the most is that David, up until this point, was extremely successful in what God has called him to do, right? And him going out and numbering and counting the children of Israel was a flex move on his part, right? It was kind of like him taking out a wad of cash and, flexing on exactly what he had accomplished and what he had done, right? And him flexing his arrogance displeased God. And God took out his anger on the children of Israel. Now, it has always confused me as to why God took out his anger on the children of Israel and not on David for what David did. What I come to understand is that the reason why God did that is because the children of Israel was the main character in the grand scheme, in the grand narrative, and not David. Right? It's kind of like you go out and buy a refrigerator, right? And you buy a refrigerator to do two things. One, to cool your food, and to preserve your food, right? And then that refrigerator breaks. What is mostly affected when the refrigerator breaks? Is it the refrigerator being affected mostly? Or is it the reason why you bought the refrigerator that's affected mostly? And it's the same thing that happened with David in this story. David was a tool to bring about a bigger narrative, a larger narrative. It was about the children of Israel and not David. You see, what God saw in this whole story, in this whole narrative, were the children of Israel and the promise that he made for and with them. God made a promise with Abraham that he will bless and multiply his children's children. And David was just a tool, the refrigerator, in bringing about, in accomplishing the promise. And David's bad decision, broken refrigerator, had more effect on the children of Israel, the preservation and cooling of the food, than it did on David. Let me show you a verse that speaks to that better than I can. Again, 1 Chronicles, the 21st chapter. Let's look at the first verse. And it reads as follows. And Satan stood up against Israel and provoked David to number the children. It's very interesting. It's very interesting. Satan stood up against who? Did he stand up against David? This verse says that Satan stood up against Israel. Satan's whole goal was Israel. Satan's goal was to disrupt the promise, to disrupt what God had planned for his people. And Satan knew in order to accomplish this, he had to break the refrigerator. And he broke the refrigerator by, if you look at the second part of this verse, it says, he provoked David. Satan understood in order to disrupt the promise of God, to stop what God was trying to do, to throw a wrench in the promise that God made with Abraham, he had to break the refrigerator. And he broke the refrigerator by provoking David to number the people. You see, and this is the larger narrative things that I keep talking about. It's more than the leader. It's more than just embarrassing the leader. It's more than bringing the leader down. It's more than the leader's reputation. And that's the point I'm trying to get across here. When a preacher falls, when a pastor falls, it affects more than him. And not only does it affect more than him, but the provocation itself was about more than him. You understand what I'm saying? When a preacher is tempted to cheat on his or her spouse, the temptation itself, yes, does affect the spouse, does affect the children, but that is the natural effect that it has. And it doesn't minimize it. It doesn't make it less consequential, the fact that the family is destroyed because of an infidelic situation, right? It doesn't lessen it. It's still a catastrophic moment when this happens, right? But there is a larger narrative even beyond your spouse, even beyond your children. There's a promise that is established. There's a promise that exists. And the provocation itself is for that promise is for what God has established and what God has called you for and called you to. You got to understand that the mistakes that a leader makes in the church isn't just to bring that leader down. It's about that calling and promise in you. What has God promised you? What is your calling? What is the promise that God has made in your life? God promised you that He will heal you of whatever sickness, whatever emotional sickness, whatever mental sickness. Then all of a sudden your pastor falls into a lustful situation. The provocation for that lustful situation affected his family naturally. But the larger narrative is that promise in you. Satan is trying to stop that promise in you. Satan stood up against Israel. Satan didn't stand up against David. When your leader falls, it's not Satan standing against your leader. It isn't Satan standing up against your pastor. It's not Satan standing up against the CEO of your company. It's not Satan standing up against the leader. The larger narrative is the promise. The larger narrative is what God has promised in you. He's trying to get at you. Let's look at the 7th verse. It explains it even better. Look at the 7th verse, and it reads as follows. And God was displeased with this thing, therefore He smote Israel. What was God displeased with? God was displeased with the decision that David made to number the people. And as a result of what David did, and in response to what David did, God's reaction was on the people who God had called him to. What David did affected his calling, the physical manifestation of his calling. What David did brought hardship on his calling, whom God had called him to. What David did affected God's promise. And these are the things that you have to keep in mind as a leader. What's happening to you right now isn't about you. It isn't about you, your embarrassment. Satan isn't trying to discredit you. Satan isn't trying to take your business. Satan isn't trying to take your wife. Satan isn't trying to destroy your legacy. Satan understands that beyond your office, that beyond what you are physically doing, whether it may be a business, whether it may be the pastoralship, that beyond what you do in that office, there's a promise that exists to the people that you are affecting, your employees, every one of them. God has promised something to them. There's a promise in them by God through their relationship with the Almighty. God has placed in them a promise. God has placed in them a vision. God has placed in them an effect that they will have on the world, and the effect that they will have on people surrounding them. This thing that you're going through is for that, more so than it is for your bank account, more so than it is about the destruction of your business, and what people will write about you in the blogs, what people will write about you in the newspaper, what people may say about you on TV and the internet. It's larger than that. There are people who are called to affect the world under your leadership. And your temptation to take that money will affect that. Your temptation to go out into the strip clubs will affect that. That temptation to disrespect your husband, to disrespect your marriage, that temptation to do whatever mistake that is looming over your head is much larger than you. It's about the promise. It's about Israel. It's about what God has promised them. And you need to keep that in mind when you're choosing a leader, man. Is that man of God or woman of God able to stand against the provocation? Because you know what's going to be affected by it? Your calling. When you step under a leader, you bring with you a calling. You bring with you a promise. And because you've set yourself under a leader, Satan is going to provoke that leader to stop the promise in you, to negate the promise in you, because he is the tool that God is going to use to cultivate, to enhance, to bring out that calling in you. So, in choosing a leader, understanding your calling, is your leader strong enough to withstand the provocation that will be caused because you stepped under him or her? Are you called to the world? Well, understand that humongous calling comes with you when you set yourself under a leader, and Satan will provoke that leader against that calling. And leader, you got to understand, this goes beyond TV. This goes beyond likes. This goes beyond clicks. This goes beyond hanging out with the famous preachers. This goes beyond everything that you can imagine right now. There are humongous promises under you. There are humongous promises in your responsibility. And accepting the role of a leader, you are accepting that promise. You're accepting that you are going to pull out, you're going to cultivate, you're going to bring into fruition those callings, those promises. And ultimately, man, when it's all said and done, the grade that you will get as a leader will not be how many people sat in the pews. It won't be how often you were found on every channel of the TV, or what state or what website you had. It will be the results, the ultimate results of the calling and the promises of the people under you. God's going to look at those people and say, okay, I call this person to be. How did you affect that person? How did you bring about that calling in that person? I've called this person to be. How successful were you in your leadership, in making, in creating, cultivating, allowing the promise of God to come about? That will be your goal. That will be your grade. That will be the ultimate stamp as to whether or not you were a great minister or not, whether you were a great leader or not. David was a great leader. He did great things. People even say that he created instruments. People say that he wrote poems. The Bible said he was a man after God's own heart. But this verse shows us, man, he allowed himself to be provoked. He allows Satan to be successful in bringing momentarily a partition between God and what he promised his children. All right, man, I gotta go. I hope I brought that to light. I hope you understand what I'm trying to get across. Your true role as a leader is a tool through which and by which to preserve the promise that's inside the people you are called to. There's a promise in those people sitting in your pew. There's a promise in those children that you're raising. There's a promise in all the people you've employed. And God has chosen you as a leader to bring out, to preserve, to flourish that promise in them. It's not about you, man. All right, man, I gotta go. I say it every week. I mean it every week. My name is Jeff Staten, and thank you for showing up today. And this is Pressing Toward the Mark. With love.